Hi, this is Natalie from Everyday Social Dynamics, and I am back with part two of the reaction. I can't remember where to look, of the reaction to the Vice debate discussion on colorism, appropriation and skin bleaching. Part one I will link below, and I think let's get straight into this. Thank you for joining me for part two. Let's continue. Let me get the tab.
I don't have much to add, but I do think that
before we go on, I guess it might be useful just to sort of talk about where we got to last time. So this debate is a panel of people from a range of different backgrounds who have been talking about their experiences around, or their thoughts and experiences around colorism, around skin bleaching, were the two topics that we got to in part one. And my contribution really is just to think about the ways that we can explore these topics, explore them in a way that understands that there's an emotional undercurrent, to think about the ways that it is important in terms of how we go about life, how we manage our social dynamics, how these kinds of topics and experiences have an impact on our day-to-day. And so this discussion is a really interesting one. It is, yes, from a United States perspective. But as I've been going through, I've been adding some of the UK flavour to that, where it kind of relates to my experience, and also thinking about things not just in a current day context, but also thinking about where things are from history, from other parts of the world where there are African people, wherever we exist in the diaspora, and bringing in as much of that kind of knowledge and experience wherever possible in thinking about some of the points that are being made. We only got to 16, nearly 17 minutes the last time. I don't know if that means I'm going to be slower or quicker this time. I'm going to see what happens. If it's an interesting point, I'm going to pause. That's just how it is, but let's get going.
what I would like for this conversation to do is less of focusing on like your personal experience of skin bleaching in the business, and more of just like you as someone who like had a lived experience of being darker skinned, like you saw, and like you like had like the material experience of like receiving discrimination and like feeling less desirable, and like once your skin became lighter, like it opened up opportunities and doors for you. I think that that's what this conversation needs to focus on.
Yes.
Of just like actual, like that is a very clear experience and example of colorism. Like it is real, it happens.
When
Like
you're
I think
lighter, yeah, people treat you differently.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that, and I do think and I said it in the first half of this video, that if this I want to call her baby girl, that's her name that she was given in the first half, not in any kind of a disrespectful way, but just because she just seems a lot younger than me, but just to think about what it means if somebody has gone from darker, and as she said, I got 2 to 3 shades lighter, and probably lighter still since she's been bleaching. If her life is different, if her experiences are different, how on earth can anybody tell her that she's done the wrong thing? And this is a really, really, really key point, that yeah, we can criticize an individual person, but if they say, as they are walking through the world, they have noticed a difference from how they were treated when they were dark-skinned to how they're being treated now they are lighter-skinned, how can somebody argue with that? It is her experience. Whether it's confirmation bias is a different thing, but certainly it becomes a very techie argument when you want to try and say to somebody what you think is wrong, but they're going to say, no, well, I've lived it. I know it. I felt every moment of the difference, and I feel every moment of the different treatment now.
like that's what I think this conversation really needs to center on. Why is it societally that being lighter skinned has very clear material advantages of both beauty, desirability, romantic relationships, socioeconomic opportunities. Like, this is real.
Who here has had pressure from their mother or their family, or have heard those messages from within the household about colorism, and who wants to share that experience?
So I think one of the experiences of colorism that has stuck with me, and I know that like my mother, of course, like she said this offhandedly, but you know, as a child, like that's something that's rooted in you. But I remember one time and she was just like, you don't need to marry somebody that's like your shade or darker. Like your kids are gonna come out too dark.
Yeah, that's common. Don't marry anyone that's darker than you, your shade or lighter. You don't want anybody that's got a really broad nose. You don't want to marry anybody that then we can sometimes kind of do it by nation. You don't want somebody from here, but somebody from there is okay. Make sure you get somebody with really soft hair. You don't want anybody who's got a tough head or a picky head. Yeah, standard. If you've experienced any of that, let me know in the comments. From wherever you happen to be in the world, I definitely think that that is something that several people have heard. And what I would say, but it's different for me because of my complexion, is that I never had those conversations. But of course, I wouldn't. I never had anybody in my family say you don't want to marry anybody darker than you. You want to keep up that light skinned. I never had that, but certainly know of lots of people who have and who have heard and have experienced. And I think again, absolutely right. There is a whole thing then about what becomes internalized. And then you hear those things when you're young. Where does it go? How do we process it? If we don't actively find a way to process that, it comes out in our choices, in our actions, in what we consider to be good and bad, better or worse, pretty and beautiful and ugly. And in so many ways, it impacts the way that we interact with the world socially, with not only ourselves, but with others too.
And I just remember being like, damn, like, is there something wrong with me?
Moving here after 9/11, there was a huge push, I think, in the Middle Eastern community to look as white as possible. So it wasn't necessarily that it was the beauty standard, but rather a way to not get hate crimed or to kind of stay under the radar. And so my mom would tell me things like, tell people you're Russian and things like that. So kind of like keeping a proximity to whiteness was seen as a safer idea.
Ella?
For me, in my family dynamic, it didn't come down to skin as so much as hair politics. So my hair, when I was a child, was very thick and straight, like a tapestry of hair. And then it got curly with puberty. And as my hair got curly, my mom, without discussion, stepped in with the executive decision that we would be straightening my hair.
Psychologists have discovered that
Ads. We can mute ads. I think this is another really interesting thing, isn't it, around colorism, because then you get texturism. And I was like, is texturism, I've known about it, but in terms of it being a word and something that was kind of acknowledged as a point of discussion with its own sort of terminology, that was definitely something that was different. And again, just thinking about families and how they work, this whole notion that somebody is watching you grow and watching your development and thinking, that's curly, we need to relax it, we need to straighten that out. You know, they're getting too dark, we need to get them out of the sunshine. They want to run around and play. We need to make sure that they're fully covered up. And just to think that people go through their lives with those experiences of somebody all constantly checking on your development. Is your nose getting bigger? Is your hair getting curly? Is your skin getting darker? Are you 2 or 3 shades lighter than you were before? Imagine just constantly living under that from your parents. So as we said before in part 1, socially and sort of stepping out of your front door into the world, we are constantly bombarded with all of these different messages around what is beautiful, what is desirable, what is the right way to look. But then imagine that in your house, somebody's constantly looking, exploring, examining you, waiting for those moments that your blackness is going to start showing itself and wanting to stamp down on that. That's a huge issue, and one that definitely does need to be explored very carefully and very sensitively, because the challenges are, once we start getting into those parent conversations and those family conversations, that's a whole nother Oprah show, as I like to say. Let's continue.
Like, oh, like you're almost there. Like if we can control your hair, if we can get your hair a certain texture, you could be mistaken for white. And that reflects well on us.
Anybody else want to share their experience of colorism from their families?
When I was younger, my little brothers were much like lighter than me. So I think at a very early age, I understood that society ascribed like lightness to like femininity and like darkness to masculinity. I think a lot of what I struggled with when I was younger was like blaming myself and like not like being confused as to why I was being treated differently. So when I was old enough to understand what colorism was and how many systems are at play, and that it really has nothing to do with me and everything to do with how people like are conditioned, I think it was liberating for me. That really helped me start.
These camera angles are just making me smile. So that whole thing was, so you understand the systems well, okay, whatever. Like, why are they doing that on baby girl in the front with the braids and the skin bleaching products? I think that's the difference, isn't it? The difference is between somebody that has, it's such a cliche, but done the work to understand where these things come from, to help them make sense of their own experience. But the challenge is that the experience has been had, the feelings have been felt and sometimes internalized, sometimes resulting in negative outputs, negative actions, damaging actions. And then if you're lucky enough to have somebody that's either in your family or in your friendship group or at university or friends or your community or whoever that is able to say, but you know where this all comes from, right? You know why this is a factor, right? You know why this is a reason why you think this. It's only some of us that have access to those people. I was really lucky. I went to a supplementary school, Saturday school in England, which was very much something that came out of the African Caribbean tradition of strong understanding, strong importance on education, and also recognizing that for Black children in the UK that they often weren't going to be viewed as, seen as able, as intelligent, as bright as other children. And so the supplementary education, the Saturday schools were set up to supplement our education that we were getting in schools. But what was beautiful about Saturday school, that's very London, about Saturday school, was the fact that it talked about history and culture and a connection to our roots and an understanding that as people from the Caribbean, our root is in Africa. We didn't know where specifically. We could maybe have a vague idea of being from somewhere in West Africa, but because of the process of transatlantic enslavement and arriving, being taken to, stolen away to the Caribbean islands, we didn't have that direct connection, right? But Saturday school for me just gave me such a strong foundation in terms of knowing, understanding, connecting to an Africanness and an African root, and understanding that our phenotypes are vast. There is no one archetype African. People think it, and I know that because sometimes of the processes of colonialism and of movement, that we have some of those mixes, and even those mixes are often deemed more attractive than others. But it doesn't mean that somebody is a real African just because they are very, very dark skinned, and you're not a real African because you are lighter skinned. But that was an education that was bestowed upon me. That was something that just gave me such a solid grounding. And I'm so grateful to my mum for doing that, because it meant that a lot of the conversations and a lot of the challenges, a lot of that kind of I'm better than you because I'm lighter than you, or those internationality conversations, and this one's from that island and that one's from this island and that one's from Africa and this one isn't. I feel really blessed that I have escaped it in terms of being part of any kind of conversations about it, but also escaped it because I wasn't raised like that in my house. We had a Pan-African household. It made a massive difference. So, but it also gave me a deep understanding of where this stuff comes from, of where colorism originates, of the fact that it is real. So as Sis said in the back, it is real. It is a real thing. And not because of my experience do I try to negate it, but I feel so fortunate that I haven't had to necessarily go through the process that the young woman in the front has had to go through, which is feeling that, not because I'm talking about reverse colorism, but that idea that, well, I'm better because I'm lighter, not even a little bit, and having to be deprogrammed from that is something that I have been blessed to not have had to go through. And I put all of that down to the education that was provided in my home and the education that was given to us through Saturday School. Big up Andy Johnson, a well-known educator from the South London area, now passed on, Guyanese immigrant to the UK, but an exceptional human in terms of everything that he did around education and supplementary education there in South London.
Thinking of myself as beautiful.
For me, many would probably assume that my parent pushed it on me, but it's definitely the opposite. Like my mom, she always tells me that I'm beautiful. Like even when I was darker, she always told me I was.
It's a mad statement, isn't it? Even when I was darker. Ooh.
Beautiful. She never said I had to use cream or use anything to lighten my skin. I just got influenced by the media, honestly.
Yeah, I have a similar experience. My mom, she really embraced my hair, told me it was beautiful, and encouraged me to grow it. But I just remember watching TV, Disney Channel, and all of these things, and asking, why can't my hair look like that? Why can't it be straight? So for me, it's the same. I saw it more through the media, but I was still getting that support from my family, that, that encouragement.
Yeah, it's pretty obvious. I think, what's permeating for me is information and accessibility to that. I grew up in the Bronx, so people are around people that look like them for almost their whole lives, and so they don't. It's so embedded that way. It's so embedded. They stay in the projects forever. And I managed to leave. I went out of the hood to get an education, and and I already didn't look like them because of my fair skin. I'll go back.
Kevin is hilarious. This is Kev, if you didn't know. So we met Kev in the first half of this, so in part 1, and he just continues to make me laugh with his reactions. But we heard this young lady at the front. She calls herself mixed race Puerto Rican, and she used the word fair, and I get it. It's something that we talked about in part 1, that the word fair means beautiful, and what happened was people started to equate lighter skinned with being beautiful, and so just used the word fair. I personally have got rid of it out of my vocabulary when I'm discussing complexion as we are on this particular video, but it's a very interesting terminology, and when people use it, it kind of gives you a bit of an insight into what they've been indoctrinated in, and not yet indoctrinated out of. And I say that just because, like lots of words that we used and then we kind of understand what they mean, then we choose not to use them. It just sounds like that process hasn't yet happened in this particular context.
And I've been having these conversations, these kind of like esoteric seeming conversations that people that I grew up with have never had before.
I think that's interesting. I'm sorry. I gotta be the odd man out again, I guess. What I'm hearing is that because you had a different experience, you think that the people who stayed home, because people just stay home, they don't leave their hometowns, you think that they've been held back because of their race?
No, that's not what I'm saying at all. No.
Yeah, no, Kev, she didn't say that at all. I think, anyway, let's hear what she actually said, but she didn't say that, Kev. Maybe a bit more listening, a bit less interrupting, Kev.
Well, that's not what I said. Racial experience will change depending on where you're located, I think, is all I'm saying. And so people might not have as much of an awareness of how they are different from others if they're in a homogeneous environment. So it isn't until they experience something different and are in an environment of diversity and of different experience that they see, oh, wait, maybe I am of marginalized experience. And then they bring that back and, you know, they can try and pretend like they never saw that, but, you know, and try and integrate back into their home life, but that's impossible. You can't unsee it.
That's interesting, because I think the idea that somebody, we're not on YouTube Premium, don't know that we ever will be, is the thing. So it's interesting to kind of think about this from the perspective of traveling out, and I guess this means outside of the US and outside of the Bronx, as she said, that's where she lived, where she's from, and that because of the way that people live in such homogenous groups, that their thoughts and experiences around how the world interacts with them becomes also skewed, because you're around other probably mixed race Puerto Ricans, or around Puerto Ricans that consider the lighter you are, the better that you are. And it sounds like what she's saying is that I'm around people who are really like me, so we don't interact, or our social dynamics become smaller in a way, because we're not having those experiences of being in a much bigger kind of pool of different people to kind of sense, oh, this is how that works here, but that's how it works here, and kind of navigating through lots and lots of different social environments. That's what I got. Is that what you got? Let me know in the comments. And I need to work out how to touch these buttons a lot quicker, but I'm getting there.
To colorism, but let's talk about the media and the cultural aspect.
I noticed there's an oversaturation of lighter skinned biracial women who are sort of meant to be the representatives of blackness on TV. I also think representation definitely can't fix everything, right? But I think seeing more dark skinned women in the media, like Lupita Nyong'o, who's just gorgeous, I was like, well, if she's beautiful, it's why do I think dark skin is ugly? And I think it becomes frustrating when you feel like you constantly have to wait for representation. Everyone will get representation before you.
And even when we are presented.
Yes. And I think that's a really interesting point. What's quite, I want to say depressing, and I don't know if that's the right word. These are not new conversations. These have been being had since I was little, before I was born, around my parents' time, around my grandparents' time. And you just think to yourself, nothing shifts, nothing really has moved. To hear that young woman in the front row who's nowhere near 30, nowhere near it. I would argue that she's nowhere near 30. To hear her still having these conversations that I was having, we were talking about in my day when I was 16, 17, 18 at college, and in my 20s at university, we were talking about, rap videos always have light-skinned women in it, and then they don't. The dark-skinned women are always the butt of a joke or being viewed as the ugly kind of foil to the light-skinned woman. In Coming to America, it's Coming to America, isn't it? The two sisters, the dark-skinned one was really loud and boisterous, and the light one was the one who was seen as the desirable potential wife, and the white. And you just think, this stuff is just old. It's old. And we know that. It's generations old. But the conversations also now, the recognition that something needs to change, are also old. So not just an awareness of its existence is not... The awareness of its existence, the fact that it has existed, is generations old. The fact, hundreds of years old. The fact that we know that it's an issue is now also old. So this says, what on earth are we doing about it if we're still having these same conversations about these same factors, and saying, oh, we've got Lupita Nyong'o, who is one actress, but how long are we still going to be having these same conversations and not necessarily seeing the change? So that means that generation after generation after generation is experiencing the same thing, because it is a system, because it is a structure, because if it's going to be dismantled, the people who are the architects of it need to dismantle it. This is the whole and entire point around this. The Black folks that are speaking, who have different viewpoints, are talking about the symptoms of the structure. The structure still exists. It's not gone anywhere. It's not going anywhere. These are now old, long time conversations that are still being had. That's also something that really does need to be explored. We're still talking about it.
They were presented as ghetto and loud and like we're not meant to be in a relationship. Like we always like stress our partner out. We're annoying. Like we complain a lot, and it just sucks. Like I was saying, like it does do something to your head. And I personally feel like Black women are at the bottom of the barrel. Like nobody wants Black women. Like nobody desires Black women. They basically think we're trash. And that gets to your head, especially when you have a whole bunch of, even celebrities, like men, Black men, like wanting to be with white women or lighter skinned women. It makes you feel like you're just not wanted. And it makes you feel like you want to join the hype.
Yes, and that too has been a long-term conversation point around the choices that successful Black men make, and how many are in interracial relationships, or how many are in as one thing, full stop, and then how many are in relationships with women who are racially ambiguous. So if I've got to question if you're Black, then no, it's too much thinking. And again, that's an observed thing. Is it confirmation bias when you're not necessarily looking for those individuals that are in relationships with Black women? Because if you want to see something, you will always see it. If you are looking for something, you will always find it. But then there are lots of cases of individuals who are in relationships with Black women, but maybe not enough. Maybe they're not showcased enough. Maybe even those women then get categorized into, well, she's lighter skinned, this one's darker skinned. And it is a real observation. I suppose the other thing is the extent to which those images impact somebody in terms of how they conduct themselves in their own day-to-day lives. So the social dynamics of looking at someone who's a celebrity and saying, well, they've chosen a white person, or they've chosen a light-skinned partner, and then extrapolating that down into your life. Like, has that always been the case? Is that happening much more frequently now because of social media and everything is much more visible? Why is it that people are assuming that their lives are going to be the same as somebody who's a celebrity? When did that start happening? That seems to be a little bit bizarre. And not only that, why on earth would somebody even start to think that way? Don't know. Let me know your thoughts in the comments about that one.
We have made a lot of progresses in the campaigns. You do see a wider range of shades, but why is that all of a sudden a trend? You know what I mean? I'm happy it's happening, but I feel like this is something that should have been happening, you know? And also, a lot of the time you can put these wide ranges of shades in front of the lens, but my question is, when I show up to set, what's the crew giving, you know? Where there are people of color helping formulate the formulas of the product, you know? It's so much deeper than just what you see in front of the lens.
I do worry sometimes, like Isaiah said, there will be, and again, I use this word very intentionally, moments, but it often gets translated back into the culture as a trend.
I really like this point about the trending of everything, because I think we had 2020, deep COVID years, and we had George Floyd being killed. And then we had, who was, of course, one of many individuals, Black people who have been killed by the police. This is not the video for that discussion. However, what we did have in that moment was a very strong trending response from companies that said we're going to have a blackout day, and then we are going to make sure that we have more Black people in visible positions and make sure that our EDI departments are equality, diversity, and oh my goodness, that's interesting. That's really interesting. Inclusion, equality, diversity, and inclusion departments are going to make sure that we have Black people at the forefront of that, and Black people in adverts. And it did become almost like, hold on a minute. Even me, I was a bit like, there's a lot of this now. It just crept up on me in a way where I was used to seeing the white family, seeing the white adverts, seeing. Now everything was often, which I have to say, then it became, well, there was a Black man with a white woman and a mixed race child. And then it became, oh my God, there's a Black couple on the program. Oh my goodness, there's a Black family in an advert. But it was everywhere, and it did feel performative. And then somebody else might argue, but that's what you said you wanted representation. And some people like me would say it was a lot. And because it was so much so quickly, I don't know if I can trust it as being genuine. So I definitely agree with that whole point around it feeling like a trend, and 100% agree with the whole thing around, but who are the creative directors? Who are the directors? Who are the producers? Who's the person who's actually conceptualizing the ad or the campaign? Because a lot of the times the things that people think Black people care about are not the things that we care about. Am I trying to speak for the monolith? Kind of, sort of. But oftentimes you're like, no one, that's really not a factor that we're that interested in. That wasn't something, you can tell that was not a Black person that came up with that. But you've got Black people in front of the screen with the assumption that it means that there are Black people behind the work. And we know that unfortunately isn't the case.
Trends are not lasting. Trends are not legislation. Trends are not resources. Trends are not restructuring of ideas and resources.
Let's bring it back to social media for a second. What do you think first when you hear the word cultural appropriation?
Cultural appropriation to me is not braids that are being stolen or something, or things that are, you know, people. If somebody can do braids and they want to do braids, they can do braids. That's not cultural appropriation to me. It might be cultural appreciation, and I think that that's something that is looked over a lot. I think that cultural appropriation comes in place where, like political parties will use struggles of Black people to get laws passed or something like that. That to me is cultural appropriation.
like, that is an important point, but that's not cultural appropriation. No, I don't think that's cultural appropriation, Kev. Oh, see, Kev's an interesting character. Like, I'm with him, and then he just says things, and then he just goes, and then I'm like, no, I'm not with you anymore, Kev. Definitely, I think the way that some communities are used and harnessed can be quite cynically done, but I don't know that I'd call that cultural appropriation. The whole thing around braids is not so much that somebody has braids, but it's the point that somebody has braids and then they somehow become the originator. They become deemed beautiful on a particular type of head and not on another type of head. And when they're on a certain type of head, they're viewed as ghetto, they're viewed as inappropriate, they're viewed as wrong. And on someone else, it's the most innovative, most creative thing that they've ever seen. That's the issue. So Kev, help me here.
When it comes to cultural appropriation, the reason why, for example, indigenous peoples of the Americas don't want you wearing a headdress is because what has happened for the last 500 years, like literally acts of genocide, being put in boarding schools, like literally being killed and discriminated against and experiencing real harm for like being able to wear their cultural traditions. We're talking about the black hair textures discrimination legally because it happens, because there are like, for example, schools, like workplaces, like various forms of employment that say that like you as a black person having this black hairstyle will not be accepted. Like, we're not okay with that. And so when I see a white girl wear Fulani braids or type of braids, whatever type of braids, I'm just like, you're never gonna experience in the way that like a black person is for wearing their own cultural traditions, like real like socioeconomic discrimination. Like, I don't know. I just think that I'm over it.
I kind of wanted to touch on like the idea of culture.
This is very done. They are very like, I am very finished with it. I'm not, I don't want to see white girls in braids, thanks.
Cultural appreciation. And for me, I do love when people take certain aspects of my culture and when they credit it to mine. And I think oftentimes we can see on TikTok and other medias, like sometimes white people act like they thought of an idea that's like historically existed. And that to me is not appreciation anymore.
The line for me is just between appropriation and appreciation is benefiting. You know what I mean? If you do something that a culture has been teased about, put down about, and then you put it on now that it's a trend and you're benefiting from it, you're getting these followers, you're able to raise your prices because of that. All of these things are really detrimental and they're kind of heartless.
With these platforms that are new and are emerging, the same dynamics are mirrored back to us, whether that is racism, colorism, misogyny, Islamophobia. When we have new platforms like this, they are not bigger than these things. They do not exceed these things. They literally just mirror back these same realities, these same problems, these same dynamics.
I'd love to have a conversation with that woman because one of the things that I will do on this channel is interview people around all sorts of different topics. And one of the things I find really fascinating, and my first question would be, do people tell racist jokes in front of you? And the reason why I'd like to ask that is because like she's so light. And I just think the way that as people do traverse the world becomes so interesting, even in terms of the young woman from Iran saying, white people do this, and I'm like, so what do you think you are? And that's not because I'm saying that, but that's because if encountered by that individual, I'm like, well, that's a white woman with brown hair. And it's so interesting how we do, so many of us have, maybe it is a luxury to be able to say, yes, I am a black person. There's no ambiguity, there's no question, there's no prevarication. Someone's not like, the most that I got, I've spent a lot of time in Zimbabwe, maybe one day I'll talk about that here, but I remembered that somebody did ask me if I was coloured. They were like, so you're coloured, right? And I was like, no. But I got it, but I was like, yeah, no. But I've never had to I've never had to identify into my blackness. That must be quite an interesting experience to navigate in the world.
If not amplify them.
And if you're looking for racism, you're going to find it. If you're looking for colorism, you're going to find it. And I think, and that's not, I'm not trying to negate anybody's lived experience, but I think that there's also a thing in life that if you're looking for something, you can speak it into existence.
Yeah, so to speak to that, let's say me and Kelvin were in a group chat with a non-black person and they sent a gift that could be considered a black gift. I think it's, and I accuse them of digital blackface, but he doesn't. And so, pause it there because you guys were saying like, just because something's happening or like, if we have different feelings on it, whose point of view determines if something is actually happening or not, or if we're still in the realm of opinion and feeling?
I think as a non-black person, if even one black person told me something's not okay, I would listen to them. It could be 1 out of 100. I would really...
You don't think that's dangerous? I'm sorry to cut you off, but you don't think that's dangerous?
That's insane.
Because you're giving me the power to determine how you interact with
But it's
black
really
people.
not that much power to not use a gift that's not meant for me.
This is interesting, very interesting. So point being made here is if I have an opinion and then Mary next to me. So you'll notice I'll use John and Mary, they're my go-to names, right? For my imaginary person. So I've got an opinion, Mary's got an opinion, and we're both black. And then a third person comes, a white person comes and says, well, you think this, Natalie. And they're like, but Mary thinks something different. And who is that person's view going to go to? It's a really interesting thing, which is why we need to stop talking about the individual. So if I feel like this, and if I feel that something isn't appropriation, or I feel that something isn't offensive, or I feel that I can imagine my way out of racism, that's fine on an individual basis. But my individual basis, therefore, does not mean that racism doesn't exist. And this seems to be an ongoing challenge, that because Brother Kevin over there is like, you know, if you look for racism, you'll find it. And then I roll my eyes at that. The fact that he can be experiencing racism and not feel or interpret it as racism, but I could, it's because racism is objectively a thing. It's an objective structure. It is an objective happening. If somebody comes and punches you in the face because you're black, because they have a view that means that black people don't deserve to not be punched in the face, they don't deserve any dignity, doesn't make their act less racist because Kevin decides they just punched me because they felt like punching somebody. So it becomes a really interesting point of discussion where we get to this thing of, okay then, I'm just going to speak because that's my view, and because that's my view, then it means that you are allowed to opt out of seeing things as racism. That's cool, bro, do you. But ultimately, it doesn't mean that racism doesn't exist. But if we understand that it's structural, it gives us all of this almost freedom to just know and understand it's not about how you experience it or how you decide you want to respond to it. It is what it is because it is a system and it is a structure. Kevin is just, he's my fave because he's hilarious, not for any sort of good reason.
Who said it's not meant for you? If we create content as black people, we're not posting it on a website where only black people can get into. We're sharing it with you. I think people get offended when people misuse the content that we have and abuse it. But I can't tell you what GIF. I mean, if it has the N-word in it real big, I'm gonna take offense to that. But you already knew that. You already knew that. But if it's like a niche, popular black person who does comedy and you post their GIF, I'm not gonna say, well, hey, slow down. Like I don't have that kind of power to tell someone that, and it's dangerous.
I feel like you're like devaluing people's like feelings. You know what I mean? It might not offend you, but let's say you're in a group chat and it bothered him. Why can't you just acknowledge that it bothers him and not you? You know what I mean? Some people have different feelings on different things.
Well, but here's the thing: simply disagreeing does not mean I'm not acknowledging your feelings. We can disagree because
I agree with that. I do think that there is a lot of, well, I disagree with how you feel. That means I'm negating your feelings. It's not that, but feelings are subjective, right? And so if somebody feels a certain way about something, then that's how they feel. If I don't feel the same way, that shouldn't be interpreted as I'm negating how you feel. It means I don't feel the same way. So I kind of agree with Youngblood at the front on this one.
I'm sorry, I'll just finish real quick.
Yeah.
If
But you're saying that
the
she
event of
shouldn't say
visual
it's blackface,
blackface
but
is
if it feels like it
determined
is.
by the viewer.
I think in general, like GIFs, like reaction memes, there's a sort of like flattening of people because it's like we only know that person in that context to make us laugh. But I think with like digital blackface or whatever you want to call it, there's the added like aspect of like historically black people being used as like comedic relief, like whether if you think back to like actual blackface shows and like white people painting themselves like pitch black and like doing things that they think will make other people laugh, like different like black stereotypes. So I definitely think like there's an aspect to that.
Destiny, how about you? How social media affected your view of colorism?
Like with social media, light-skinned people are important and they're pretty and this and that. And that's the same thing I want to feel. So, and there's a lot of benefits that come along with it and I want the same benefits. And I'm be honest, I want the same benefits. Like I don't care.
How do you feel hearing that, Maya?
Interesting, you asked me. First thing that came to mind was thinking about
It is interesting. Yeah, it is interesting who they pan to, who the host asks questions of. It is interesting, and I think that this young woman is interesting and not at all unique, which I think is quite sad, really, in her views,
Lil' Kim and how like so many people in 2022 be like, you look so good when you were darker skinned. I'm just like, but y'all treating her like shit. Sorry for cussing, but it's the truth. Like she literally said like, all the people I was dating would leave me for white European girls. Like y'all like talked about my nose, you talked about my featureism, and just she wanted an easier life. So I'm just like, I think about like, why are there so many material benefits to being lighter? Also, how do we make a world where darker skinned people don't have to do this, like don't have to. Like, I think that I'm interested in creating a world or like moving towards a world where we don't have like these very clear, like straight up pigmentocracy, like straight up like hierarchies of shade that are like rooted in anti-blackness. That
Pigmentocracy.
like are influenced by white supremacy, all of these things like that are interconnected with one another.
I really feel like it's never gonna change. Like we want it to change.
I want it to
we
change.
hope that it'll change, but is it really gonna change? I really don't think so.
What do you define as change?
Like change as like
You want people to
it's fair game for also dark-skinned people. Like we all are on an equal level, and I feel like that's never going to happen.
Let's talk about dating for a second. And has colorism affected your dating life, made it easier or harder?
I think often people push aside the conversations about like romantic relationships for darker skinned people and how limited and how isolating it feels to be darker skinned and experience people ridiculing you or saying purely like I'm not interested in any darker skinned person, even though there's millions upon millions of people in this world who are dark. Like, making clearly those preferences. I think that we also need to like really, really sit and think about like, what does it mean or like to feel like you're going through an entire life without experiencing like the romantic care that because we live under capitalism, often the care and like just feelings of love that we receive are regulated to romantic or familial relationships. I think that this is larger than just colorism. Like, what does it mean to not receive care because of how you look?
I can't go inside the head of every.
Yeah. And I think that that is possibly something that I might like to talk about a bit more. There's a number of It's interesting. The conversations I have with women often talk about the fact that they are not in a romantic relationship and haven't been in some time, and they want one. And lots of conversations I have with men who are opting out of being in relationships, like, it's too much headache, I can't be bothered. If I want sex, I can find it, I can get it, I can have it, but the whole thing of a relationship, that's for the birds. So I do think that's a very interesting thing to consider, and I think something that I'll definitely either just freestyle spitball one day and talk about, or maybe find something to kind of discuss really specifically around that relationship point, because I think it's an important one.
Every woman that I've ever encountered and determined if my color mattered or not. And even if they said it, it might not mean anything, it might not be true.
So it sounds like it hasn't affected, colorism specifically hasn't affected your dating life.
I can't say definitively, because
is there anybody who
can
say colorism has it affected their dating? Go ahead.
Well, when I was a kid, no one looked my way. I think it's also dependent on my features and the country I came from, but also I was many, many shades darker. And as I got older, I was more, I could say, palatable to the white man. The people that might come up to me at a bar feel more comfortable coming up to me rather than someone who might be a darker Middle Eastern person. And I've been told things like, oh, you're Middle Eastern? I thought you were white. Like, you're so pretty for Middle Eastern. And it's like, what? Like, that's such an odd thing to say to someone, but I have gotten that many times in my life when my skin tone changed.
So for me, it's reverse. In the gay world, it's different. White boys want the BBD. You know what I'm trying to say, and that's just a true phenomenon that we navigate. In that, if you're light skinned in the gay world, you're not sought after like you are as a darker male.
You're not sought after from white men
from
or
white
from
men, like
other
that.
black men.
Absolutely, because that's just they want the darker the berry, the sweeter the juice. Like that's what's sought after in the gay world, and that's specifically with white men. I haven't.
How do we feel when people?
So in part one, I was talking about the composition of the men that are on these panels. It's very interesting. This is not the first Vice discussion that I've watched. It's the first one that I've watched, sort of reacted to without watching it previously. So that's already interesting. Secondly, in terms of Kevin's point around his views, and I don't want to say it kind of makes sense now, but it kind of makes sense now. So he's saying, as a gay man who sounds like he's more attracted to white men, or definitely sounds like he wants to be attractive to white men, that because white men have categorized him as not the rough, big, appendaged, dark-skinned, roughneck black, I'm putting my own words into this now. Obviously, Kevin didn't say that, but we understand, right? We understand the stereotype that is being applied when somebody's looking at a darker skinned black man and is assuming all sorts of things about the size of his private parts. They're assuming things about probably how he lays it down. They're assuming things probably about how rough he's going to be, about how rough and tumble things are going to be. Maybe they're having their own kind of fantasies, because we know this is the thing of people calling people racial slurs through the act of being intimate with them because it's some kind of a fantasy. So we know all of that. We know where that comes from. But once again, what Kevin isn't doing is he's not doing it from the perspective of there is massive amounts of stuff that underpins all of that. He's going, in the gay world, I'm a light-skinned black man and white men want dark-skinned black men, and because I'm not it, then they don't want me. Like, is that what it comes down to? Is that what colorism comes down to? Whether one is deemed to be attractive to the people that one wants to be attractive to? I don't think that's it. I think it's much broader than that, far broader than that. But definitely that's the kind of sense I'm getting from Kevin. In a lot of the things that he says, he talks about not being chosen for a part as an actor, not being chosen by the men that he wishes to be chosen by. And it seems to me that he has just reduced this global social phenomenon into things that he hasn't got out of life. What do you think? Am I being unfair? Does that sound unfair? Does that sound unreasonable? Again, let me know what you think in the comments.
We'll talk about preferences. You know, somebody might say, you know, I don't have anything against darker skinned women. I just prefer light skinned women. I just prefer to date them.
Like, I just really implore people to interrogate why they have certain preferences. Like, we don't live in the vacuum. We're all interacting with the forces at play all of the time.
Yes.
So we don't come and arrive to our preferences independent of racism and featureism and fat phobia and texturism. I think it's all connected. So I think that's...
Why is Kevin shaking his head? Like, why? Kevin, stop it.
what confuses me. And I think people are really dishonest about the fact. So I would just say, if you have a preference for lighter skin, that's colorism. It's literally colorism.
Well, because how do you determine why someone likes something? And so I want to ask you a question. So in the beginning, you said if you're choosing someone because of their color, you're discrimination. So if I say that I only date much darker women, is that a comment that warrants a deep dive in my head? Like, what do I have against light-skinned women? Or is it only in the reverse? And at what point, again, at what point is someone's preference up for debate?
If you have...
So before Little Sis answers, what I will say is, and I say Little Sis because she just looks younger than me, I'm going to probably need to work out a way, or please, if you're watching, just tell me if you find these terminologies disrespectful. They're not at all disrespectful in any way, shape or form. But before she answers, I'm going to say this, and I'm going to say that there's this constant need that people have to equalize, but this thing tends to happen a lot in terms of men and women discussions. So woman says this happens to women, men say it happens to men too. Women say, I don't know, whatever. We can talk about something another day. And then it becomes, but men say this too. And it feels like this is kind of going down that same road. So woman says, or man says, I only like light-skinned partners. And he's saying, but what if you only like dark-skinned partners? Surely that's the same thing. And again, I come back to this point. Sorry to keep saying it. Come back to, it's not about, this thing is not bi-directional. If somebody has a preference, in other words, it doesn't go both ways. I know we like to think that everything goes both ways, but sometimes it really doesn't. So if you have decided that you have a preference for dark-skinned women, bruv, go ahead, do you. It's a beautiful thing. If you decide that you only have a preference for lighter-skinned women, you think lighter-skinned women are more attractive, they're more beautiful, there is something to be interrogated there. Why? Because socially, we are constantly told that lighter-skinned women are more attractive. They're the ones that we get shown, they're the ones that we see, they're the ones that we're told are fair, that they are beautiful, that they're more attractive, they're more desirable to have on your arm. So if you are affected by that, afflicted by that same thought process, it is worth, as Little Sis said, to interrogate what that's about. If you go through that whole process of understanding, exploring, uncovering whatever your thoughts are, and you come to, do you know what, that's what I like, I'll say respect. But most of the time, people haven't interrogated it. People haven't thought about it. They haven't considered where it comes from, and they just decide, well, it just is what it is. And most of the time, it isn't just is what it is, and that is what is being invited to be interrogated, to be explored. So it's not it goes both ways, because if I only like dark-skinned women, it's not the same thing, and we can't make these, frankly, quite facile, but it's a both ways conversation, because it isn't.
I have a preference for lighter-skinned women, and we're all agreeing, I think, that colorism exists. I don't understand how you could arrive to that preference independent of colorism, the system. I think more people prefer lighter-skinned women than darker-skinned women, and I don't think that's a coincidence. who you date says a lot about who you will advocate for, who you trust, who you believe deserves support, who you're willing to show up for.
This is why I said desirability politics, because it is political. Because of like who you deem as pretty, like goes into like these other characteristics. Who you deem as ugly goes into these other negative characteristics. So it's like, yes, like who you desire, like who do you want to like, who you're attracted to goes beyond just romantic, intimate, sexual relationships. It also very much so blends into your platonic relationships as well. Your relationships with your coworkers, all other elements of your life. Like, I think that's why like it's important to think about colorism as not just like straightly around dating or just around like preferences, but also just like how do you treat the dark-skinned people in your life? I think everybody should ask themselves that. How many dark-skinned people are in your life or in your friend group? Like how do you treat darker-skinned people, individuals of all races? Like when you meet them on a day-to-day, like what do your interactions look like? What are your thoughts about them?
I think that's a really interesting question, and I'm sitting here thinking, oh, how many dark-skinned friends do I have? How many light-skinned friends do I have? It's a really interesting question, and maybe I haven't asked myself that question because I have been fortunate enough, I think I said it in this video, I'm not sure if it was in the last one, I'm fortunate enough to have been raised around people and education structures, supplementary school. I spoke about Saturday school. That gave me an incredible grounding in terms of not having to or not entertaining the thoughts of good, bad, different, based on phenotype, based on complexion. That doesn't mean that I don't see it. It doesn't mean that I'm not aware that it exists, but it does mean that I feel that I was inoculated from quite early against a lot of those negative thoughts, right? And so when someone says, okay, how do you treat your dark skinned friends? How do you treat your lighter skinned friends? Do you treat the light ones better than the dark ones? I'm like, gosh, I've never thought about that. Maybe I should, but certainly, it's not something that I've sat down and actively thought, well, I've got so and so and so and so and so, they're light skinned, and so and so and so and so and so, they're dark skinned, and I do like not ever, not never, ever, ever, ever. Let me know in the comments, is that something that you've ever kind of categorized your friendship groups in that way?
The type of attention that I have received societally, professionally, and culturally is unlike anything that the darker women on my side of the family have experienced. It's very clear that when white people approach or engage with us or interact with us in any way, I am the one they feel comfortable talking to. I am the one that they want to take the order from. I am the one that they bring the bill to. I am the one that is deemed non-threatening. I am the one that is never loitering. I am the one that could never be doing anything wrong. And I feel like for the darker women in my family, that's extremely painful.
Thank you for sharing that.
I argue with a...
And that's what's got to be so crazy, you know, because if you're the person that is sort of getting the benefits, at least there's an honesty about that and an honesty about the experience. But imagine if you're that person that is always just receiving the positives in your group, in your family group. You not only are experiencing it as being deemed as being the preferred person, but you're around your family knowing that they are all deemed to not be the preferred person. Just the mental gymnastics, the emotional gymnastics of that has got to be something that really does need to be unpicked. And almost, I'm a strong fan of counselling and things like that. So you'll probably, as we kind of get to know each other on this channel, we'll talk more about that. But certainly that's something that not just has to be sort of unpicked with that individual, but also with the family, with the other people who are kind of thinking, well, so-and-so always gets the benefits, and so-and-so always wins the man, and so-and-so is always lucky enough to get chosen, and so-and-so is deemed as more, as prettier and better and fairer. and you are not, for whatever reason, both of those individuals need to have their individual counselling so that they can unpick those feelings and how they relate to themselves. But also that's a massive family dynamic there that really would need to be kind of worked through. And I think for so many of us, we sort of believe that things aren't important, or we think that we don't need to really address it. But just imagine how you have to navigate not just the world outside your front door, but the stuff that happens behind it inside your home too, with your family. That's a big, big thing. Wow. Thanks for sharing indeed.
We have different views on this topic. If we have so many people that are on different pages about this issue, how do we move forward as a society in changing it?
I personally
I did roll my eyes, and I rolled my eyes because, here we are again with the solutions bit in the last 4 minutes, and it won't be 4 minutes because I'm sure they do like a roundup at the end. But also just this thing of, are we really asking a room of black people how we like, and I kind of get it because colorism is intra-community, it's the intra symptom, intra-racial, intra-community within the black community is the symptom of racism. But I'm like, it's always us, isn't it? We're the victims of things, and then we're also invited to be the flipping architects of making the thing right. And this is not to disempower, but it is to say that sometimes we have to recognise that the systems that are built up are not of our making.
feel that colorism is never going to end, honestly, but if I was to give a solution, I would say people should just, promote like all skin tones and have everyone on at an equal level and not one higher than the other.
Is it contradictory that she says that but sells skin lightening products, or is she a realist? Or is she somebody that is just like, when I was lighter, my life is better and I want the same for you? I'm going to leave that there, I think.
One solution, or one kind of like tiny bit into the solution, would be just more media representation.
Yeah, I also think it starts, of course, in the home, the way you talk about it, but I think people that are in positions of power need to use their power, whether that be black people or white people. Use that power to show darker skinned people in the media. We need to see more of it.
The first thing you want to do is accept yourself. And then I think you're a little bit better equipped to fight against these things.
I think I want to kind of empower folks who don't think that they can make a difference. Yeah, and encouraging people to be more critical about their proximity to whiteness and how they take up space is one where, like, at least...
Add to my list. Accountability, identify. Pronouns, take up space.
At the local level, we can maybe start to see some shift and change.
Get out of your echo chambers. If you are around people who are saying the same things and they're thinking the same way that you do, you are part of the problem.
I think that
Kev don't disappoint, Kev don't disappoint. Kev has not disappointed me yet, not one time in this whole 43-minute program, not one time.
anything that we do to address or not address colorism will happen collectively and will happen across gender, across race, across class, across ability, and that purporting individual solutions is false and also very seductive.
Yeah, I would say I implore people to believe that change is possible on...
She's like, you on the end there saying that it's not possible. It is, actually. So change is possible. The thing is, like, if you're talking to me, you'd almost be like, oh, do you mean me? But I get it. Maybe that would be slightly too confrontational. But also, you're clearly talking to sis on the end, innit? So just say that, innit?
Many fronts, like on an individual level, like changing internally how you feel about yourself, your self-esteem, and also on a systemic level, demanding that the systems serve people who historically have been antagonized by the system. I think those two things should not be divorced from each other.
In terms of solutions to colorism, I would like to see these conversations prioritize the voices of like not just darker skinned people who have the lived experiences of colorism, but also like folks or like usually it's darker skinned people who've like done research and like have expertise on like understanding the system of dominance. Like I think that I'm really, really tired of seeing lighter skinned people like say the exact same things and parrot the voices of darker skinned people and get claps and applause by darker skinned people received antagonism, replicating colorism.
Okay. I want to thank you all for giving us your time today. I know it was got pretty intense.
Very interesting. It was a good one. I liked it. Oh no. I think, can you tell I'm learning StreamYards? I am. So I think that was an interesting discussion. This one's already gone over an hour, but it's in two parts. There'll be part one. I think one of the things that was a really interesting point at the end, which is those people who do the scholarship, who do the research, who are darker skinned, and then lighter skinned people then come and sort of talk about it. One of the things I'm really interested in is in that conversation, there was kind of lighter skinned people sometimes when they meant white, and they didn't say that. That was quite curious. But that's it. That's another Vice debate. I'm going to react to a few more. Thank you so much for joining and for watching. And if you like the video, please feel free to share it with somebody that you think might like to watch it. And it would be great if you could subscribe and turn on the notification bell for when I do another video. This is going to be, I think, something that is it's fairly interesting. I love reading your comments. I love seeing the discussion. So please do feel free to share your views, and I'll see you next time. All right, peace.